It was early morning in Hillside, a quiet suburban town where life seemed to flow at its own steady pace. The streets were clean, lined with small brick houses, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. People walked their dogs, greeted neighbors, and picked up newspapers from their porches. It was peaceful, ordinary. But for Maya Thompson, it was anything but that. Maya stood on the corner of Pine and Main, holding a brown paper grocery bag close to her chest. Inside were just a few essentials: milk, bread, and a box of tea. To anyone passing by, she looked like any other shopper, blending into the morning rush. But Maya felt every pair of eyes that lingered on her. She could almost hear the whispers she wasn't supposed to hear, sensed the unspoken questions. She adjusted her scarf nervously, not because she was cold, but because of the heavy weight of the stairs. The subtle looks were nothing new. She had lived with them her entire life, moving from one place to another, always feeling like she had to explain herself without words. But today felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Her hands tightened around the bag as her eyes darted across the street. A man in a baseball cap glanced at her, then quickly looked away. A woman hurried past, clutching her child's hand a little too tightly, like Maya was a threat. She let out a slow breath, trying to remind herself it was nothing. People always stared. It didn't mean anything. Still, she couldn't ignore the tension in her shoulders, the way her heartbeat quickened when she caught sight of the police car parked a block away. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't breaking any laws. But that didn't always matter. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself. Her voice was low, steady, but even she could hear the doubt in it. Maya glanced at her watch. 10 minutes past 9. She wasn't late, but she still wanted to be somewhere else, anywhere but here. The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of fresh coffee from the cafe behind her. It was a small comfort, reminding her of home. Home. That word felt so far away now. She hadn't stayed in one place long enough to call it that in years. Maybe she never would. But that was the price of the life she had chosen. Maya's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned her head slightly, her movements careful and deliberate, trying not to draw too much attention to herself. It was an older man, wearing a wrinkled flannel shirt and carrying a bag of oranges. He smiled politely as he passed, and Maya nodded in return. But even his friendliness couldn't shake her unease. It was like she was standing in the middle of a storm that hadn't broken yet. She didn't know when it would hit or how bad it would be, but she could feel it coming. It was in the air, in the way people avoided her gaze, yet couldn't seem to look away. Something was about to happen, and she would be at the center of it. The small crowd at the bus stop didn't help. It was just a handful of people, a young mother with a stroller, 2 teenagers scrolling through their phones, and an older man reading a newspaper. None of them paid her any obvious attention. Yet Maya felt their presence like a spotlight. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clutching her bag tighter. Her eyes flicked back to the police car down the street. The officer inside seemed busy with his radio, not even glancing in her direction. Still, Maya couldn't ignore the knot forming in her stomach. She had always been careful, always stayed under the radar. But there was no hiding here. Not in a town like this. A car honked in the distance, and Maya flinched slightly, her heart racing for just a moment. "Get a grip," she told herself. "You've been through worse." But the thought didn't ease her nerves. Every instinct in her body told her to leave, to get out of sight before anyone had a reason to question her. But running would only make things worse. She knew that better than anyone. Maya took a deep breath, forcing herself to relax. She looked up at the sky, watching the clouds drift lazily across the blue expanse. For a moment, it helped. She felt the tension ease, her grip on the bag loosening slightly. Maybe she was just imagining things. Maybe today really would be just another day. And yet, as her gaze returned to the street, her stomach dropped. The officer was stepping out of his car. Maya's heart sank as she watched him adjust his belt and start walking toward her. He wasn't in a hurry, but his movements were deliberate, purposeful. She knew this routine all too well. It had happened before, in other towns with other faces. The uniform changed, but the story stayed the same. She thought about walking away, but that would only make her look guilty. So she stayed where she was, standing tall, her expression calm and neutral. She didn't need to do anything to draw attention to herself. It always found her anyway. The officer stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see his name badge. Officer Barnes. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been friendly under different circumstances. But the way he looked at her, like she was already a problem, made her pulse quicken. "Morning," he said, his voice casual but firm. His eyes flicked to the bag in her hands, then back to her face. "Everything okay here?" Maya nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Yes, officer. Just waiting for the bus." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Haven't seen you around here before. You live nearby." The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Maya knew better. She had learned a long time ago how to read between the lines. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was testing her, looking for cracks in her story. "Just visiting," she replied. It was the truth, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. "Got some ID on you?" he asked, his tone still polite, but leaving no room for refusal. Maya hesitated for half a second, then set her bag down on the bench beside her. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out her wallet. As she handed over her ID, her fingers brushed against the badge hidden in the inner lining. She didn't take it out. Not yet. That moment would come later. The officer studied her ID for a long time, his brow furrowing slightly. Maya could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to find something, anything, that didn't add up. But there was nothing. "Just visiting, huh?" he said finally, handing the card back. "Yes, sir," Maya replied, slipping it back into her wallet. Her voice was calm, measured, but inside, her mind was racing. For now, he seemed satisfied. But she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Maya stood perfectly still as Officer Kevin Barnes looked her over, his eyes scanning every detail as though trying to find a reason to escalate the situation. She was used to this dance of suspicion, the unspoken accusations, and the subtle ways people like him tried to push her buttons. But Maya had learned a long time ago how to remain calm, how to stay in control, no matter how hostile the situation became. The officer's smirk widened as he stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. The sound felt louder than it should have, drawing the attention of a few more people nearby. Maya could feel their eyes on her now, watching, waiting to see how this would play out. She didn't need to look around to know that some of them were silently judging her, assuming she had done something wrong. It was always the same. Kevin's voice broke the silence, low and mocking. "Minding your business, huh? Funny. You sure you're in the right neighborhood for that?" Maya didn't flinch, didn't let his words sink beneath her skin. "Yes, officer. I'm right where I need to be." Her steady tone only seemed to annoy him more. He tilted his head slightly, looking down at her as if trying to assert his authority. "Is that so? Well, you're looking a little out of place to me." He gestured vaguely at the street, as if her mere presence disrupted the neat little order of this town. "Why don't you tell me exactly what you're doing here?" "I'm waiting for the bus," Maya replied simply. Her voice was calm, but inside, her nerves were taut, like a string pulled too tight. "That's not a crime, is it?" The question caught him off guard for a split second, his smirk faltering. But he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "It's not what you're doing, ma'am. It's what you're not saying." Maya arched an eyebrow. "And what would that be, officer?" Kevin didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked her over again, as if searching for something to back up his assumptions. When he found nothing, his smirk returned, though now it carried an edge of frustration. He held up her ID, turning it over in his hand like it was some sort of puzzle he needed to solve. "So, Maya Thompson," he said, drawing out her name like it was some kind of joke. "You're just visiting, huh?" Visiting who? Myself, Maya said evenly. I'm traveling through. I stopped for groceries. And now I'm waiting for the bus. That's all there is to it. Her straightforward answer didn't seem to satisfy him. Traveling through. From where? Does it matter? She asked, her voice still calm, but with just a hint of steel beneath the surface. I've done nothing wrong, officer. I'm just waiting for the bus. Kevin's smirk turned into a sneer. You're awfully defensive for someone who's done nothing wrong. And you're awfully interested in someone who's just standing on a street corner, Maya countered before she could stop herself. The words were out, sharp and pointed, but she didn't regret them. She wasn't here to play his game. The tension in the air thickened. A few people in the growing crowd exchanged nervous glances. No one said anything, but Maya could feel the weight of their silence. Some of them looked uncomfortable, while others seemed more curious than concerned. But no one stepped forward. They just stood there, watching. Kevin's jaw tightened, his smirk vanishing completely. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. You got something you want to say, ma'am? He asked, his voice low and threatening now. Maya met his gaze, unflinching. No, officer. I said everything I need to. The situation had started to draw more attention. A man on the other side of the street had stopped walking, his phone in hand, the camera angled discreetly toward Maya and Kevin. Another woman nearby stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, while her child tugged on her sleeve, asking to leave. Maya noticed all of this in her peripheral vision, but didn't let it distract her. She kept her focus on Kevin, knowing he was looking for any excuse to escalate. Kevin, meanwhile, seemed to revel in the attention. He glanced over his shoulder at the growing crowd, his lips curling into a smirk once more. All right, ma'am, he said loudly, as if putting on a show. How about we take this conversation somewhere else? Maybe down to the station. Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. Is there a reason for that, officer? She asked, her voice measured. Or am I being detained without cause? The question seemed to catch him off guard again, but only for a moment. It's called keeping the peace, he said, his tone smug. And you're making people uncomfortable. Maya glanced around, letting her eyes linger on the faces of the onlookers. Some looked away, suddenly finding the ground or their phones incredibly interesting. Others stared back, their expressions blank. No one spoke up. No one defended her. She turned back to Kevin. If anyone here is uncomfortable, she said evenly, it's because of you. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Kevin looked like he might lose his temper. His face reddened, and his hand twitched toward his belt, where his radio and other equipment were clipped. But he stopped himself, glancing at the crowd again. All right, he said, his voice colder now. Let's do this the hard way then. Before Maya could respond, Kevin reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was firm, almost painful, as he started to pull her toward his car. The grocery bag slipped from her other hand, spilling its contents onto the pavement. Apples rolled across the sidewalk, one of them stopping at the feet of a young boy who was watching wide-eyed from the safety of his mother's side. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone gasped. Another person muttered something under their breath, too quiet for Maya to hear. But still, no one stepped forward. Maya didn't resist. She let Kevin pull her a few steps before stopping abruptly, planting her feet firmly on the ground. Her calm demeanor was gone now, replaced by a quiet fury that simmered beneath the surface. Let go of me, she said, her voice low but commanding. Now, Kevin hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her tone. For a moment, he looked uncertain, like he wasn't sure what to do next. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He tightened his grip instead, his smirk returning. Or what? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You gonna make a scene? Maya stared at him, her expression cold and unyielding. I'm giving you one last chance, officer, she said quietly. Let me go, or you're going to regret it. The street had fallen unnaturally quiet, save for the heavy sound of Kevin's boots scuffing against the pavement and the hushed murmurs of the crowd. Maya's groceries lay scattered on the ground, the apples rolling in different directions like tiny green and red marbles. For a moment, Maya simply stood there, her steady gaze locked on Kevin. She didn't move to pick up her groceries. She didn't back away. The tension in the air was palpable, almost suffocating. Kevin's hand remained clamped around her arm, his grip firm and unrelenting. His sneer deepened as he leaned in closer. "What's the matter? Got nothing to say now?" he taunted. Maya didn't flinch. She met his stare with a calm resolve that seemed to unnerve him, though he wouldn't show it. "I've already said enough," she replied softly, her voice steady. "You should think carefully about your next move." Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Kevin's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but then his arrogance took over. He tightened his grip, as if asserting his dominance would erase the flicker of doubt she had planted in his mind. Loitering, resisting, causing a disturbance, he rattled off, ignoring her warning. "I can take you in for any of those, you know." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Can you?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. "Because I've done none of those things." Kevin's jaw clenched, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in public, and certainly not by someone like Maya. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he snapped. "Think you're better than me?" Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence only seemed to fuel his anger further. By now, the crowd had grown. More people had stopped to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and quiet disapproval. A few of them exchanged hushed words, glancing between Maya and Kevin. One man, a middle-aged bystander with glasses, had his phone out, recording everything. The red light on the camera blinked steadily, capturing every second of the tense encounter. Maya noticed the man out of the corner of her eye. She gave no sign that she cared about being recorded, but inwardly she was relieved. Let them record, she thought. Let them see. She knew this moment was bigger than just her. Kevin, on the other hand, hadn't noticed the camera yet. He was too focused on Maya, too consumed by his need to assert control over the situation. "You're not from around here," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "People like you don't just come here without a reason." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what reason do you think I have?" Kevin's sneer returned. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'll find out." It was then that someone from the crowd finally spoke up. "Hey man, let her go," a young man called out, his voice uncertain, but brave enough to cut through the silence. "She's not doing anything wrong." Kevin shot the young man a glare that could have frozen fire. "Mind your own business," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." The young man hesitated, his courage wavering under the officer's intimidating stare, but the seed had been planted. A few others in the crowd began murmuring louder, their disapproval growing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that people were starting to question Kevin's behavior. Maya felt the shift in the crowd's energy, but she didn't rely on it. She knew how quickly public support could waver, how easily fear could silence even the boldest voices. Instead, she focused on Kevin, her composure unshaken. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make him pause. Kevin scoffed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his demeanor now. "The only mistake here is you thinking you're above the law." "I never said that," Maya replied. "But I do know my rights, and I know you're crossing a line." Her words seemed to hit a nerve. Kevin's face darkened, and before she could react, he shoved her. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough to make her stumble. Maya caught herself quickly, straightening up with quiet dignity. She dusted off her jacket, her movements slow and deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. The crowd gasped collectively, their murmurs growing louder. A few more phones were raised, cameras pointed directly at Kevin now. The officer noticed this time, and for a brief moment, Uncertainty flashed across his face. "You don't want to do this," Maya said again, her tone calm but firm. Her words were a warning, not a plea. Kevin's arrogance blinded him to the warning. "And why's that?" he sneered. "You think you can intimidate me? Huh. You think you can just talk your way out of this?" "I don't need to talk my way out of anything," Maya replied, her voice as steady as ever. "But you should think very carefully about what you're doing." Her composure only enraged him further. Kevin stepped closer, towering over her, his face inches from hers. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he spat. "I'm the one in charge here." Before Kevin could say anything else, a voice from the crowd interrupted him. "You better stop, officer," the man with the camera called out. His voice was loud and clear now, no longer hesitant. "You're being recorded. Everyone here is watching." Kevin froze, his head snapping toward the man. His expression faltered for the first time, his bravado cracking under the weight of the truth. He glanced around, realizing just how many phones were pointed at him now. The crowd had grown larger, and the murmurs had turned into quiet, collective disapproval. Maya remained silent, watching him carefully. She could see the gears turning in his head, the moment he began to realize he might have pushed too far. But his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "You people don't know what you're talking about," he said defensively, releasing Maya's arm. "I'm just doing my job." "No, you're harassing her," someone else called out. "We all see it." Kevin's face reddened, and for a moment, he looked like he might lash out at the crowd. But the cameras stopped him. He knew the consequences of being caught on video. He had seen it happen to other officers, had probably mocked them in private. And now, here he was, the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Maya took a step back, smoothing her jacket as she regained her composure. "It's not too late to walk away," she said softly, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. Kevin glared at her, his fists clenching at his sides. But he didn't say anything. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, emboldened by his silence. Maya stood quietly, waiting for Kevin to make his next move. She could feel the weight of the moment, the tension that hung in the air like a fragile thread about to snap. She had been here before, in situations just like this, and she knew how to play the long game. Kevin didn't. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling under the watchful eyes of the crowd. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and turned away, heading back to his patrol car. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, their murmurs softening as the tension began to dissipate. Maya didn't move until Kevin was back in his car. Only then did she bend down to pick up her groceries, her movements slow and deliberate. She felt the eyes of the crowd on her, some filled with sympathy, others with quiet admiration. One by one, the onlookers began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the background as they returned to their daily routines. But the man with the camera stayed behind, lowering his phone as he approached her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice kind but cautious. Maya nodded. "I'm fine," she said simply. He hesitated, then held up his phone. "I got it all on video, if you need it." "Thank you," Maya said, offering him a small, genuine smile. "I might." The man nodded, slipping his phone into his pocket. He glanced at Kevin's car one last time before walking away, leaving Maya alone once more. As the bus pulled up to the curb a few minutes later, Maya climbed aboard, her groceries safely back in her arms. She settled into a seat near the window, her gaze focused on the passing scenery. The encounter with Kevin played over in her mind, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the world to see the truth. The air seemed to shift the moment Kevin barked, "You're under arrest." It was as if the whole world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Kevin's hand hovered over the handcuffs clipped to his belt, his face twisted in a mix of smugness and irritation. He was confident he had the upper hand. But Maya didn't move to resist. She didn't panic or argue. Instead, She straightened her posture, her expression calm but firm. With one deliberate motion, she reached into her jacket. The crowd tensed, some gasping audibly, as if expecting something dramatic. And they got it. When Maya's hand emerged, it wasn't empty. She held a badge, polished and unmistakable. The letters FBI gleamed under the morning sun. She raised it high enough for everyone, including Kevin, to see. The effect was instantaneous. The small crowd erupted in a collective gasp, followed by a stunned silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Kevin froze, his hand still hovering near his handcuffs, his face draining of all color. His smug demeanor melted away, replaced by wide-eyed shock. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. "You really should have checked my ID more carefully," Maya said, her voice steady, but tinged with authority that left no room for argument. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight, cutting through the thick silence like a knife. She took a step closer to Kevin, and though she was smaller in stature, her presence now towered over him. Her gaze was sharp, unwavering. "Special Agent Maya Thompson," she announced, her words slow and deliberate. "FBI. I'm here investigating corruption within this very department." The crowd erupted into whispers, their murmurs filled with disbelief and curiosity. Phones that had been recording the encounter zoomed in on Maya's badge, capturing every detail. The tension in the air was now electric, the dynamic of the scene shifting entirely in Maya's favor. Kevin stumbled over his words, his bravado crumbling. "I didn't know. I mean, you didn't say anything." Maya's gaze hardened, her voice cutting him off like a blade. "That's the problem, Officer Barnes. You didn't bother to know." Kevin took a step back, visibly shaken. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a desperate need to salvage the situation. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, raising his hand slightly, as if surrendering. "I was just doing my job." "Your job." Maya's voice was sharp, each word precise and piercing. She took another step forward, her badge still in hand. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate innocent people. And yet here you are, abusing your authority in broad daylight, with witnesses and cameras all around. Do you think that's acceptable?" Kevin's face turned beet red. He opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it again, realizing he had no defense. The crowd, emboldened by Maya's revelation, began murmuring louder. Some openly criticized Kevin's actions, their voices growing more confident with each passing second. "She's FBI," someone in the crowd whispered, the disbelief evident in their tone. "Looks like it," another replied. "Man, he really messed up." Maya let the voices of the crowd fill the air for a moment before speaking again. Her tone was calm but unrelenting, each word landing like a hammer. "This isn't just about you, Officer Barnes. It's about the culture in this department, the unchecked power, the corruption, the misuse of authority. And you've just given me everything I need to expose it." Kevin's hands trembled slightly as he took another step back, his earlier confidence now completely shattered. I didn't mean," he started, but Maya held up a hand, silencing him. "This isn't the time for excuses," she said firmly. "You've been warned before about your conduct, haven't you?" Kevin's eyes widened further, and the crowd collectively leaned in, eager to catch every word. Maya's revelation was like gasoline on a fire, igniting the whispers into full-blown conversations. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her phone still recording. She pointed directly at Kevin. "I've seen him do this before," she said loudly, her voice shaking with emotion. "He's always stopping people for no reason. I've heard him say things, horrible things." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd, emboldening others. A man nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I've seen it too. He picks on people who can't fight back." More voices joined in, their accusations forming a wave of condemnation that Kevin couldn't outrun. His eyes darted around wildly, his chest heaving as panic set in. The power he had wielded so carelessly was now crumbling in the face of collective resistance. Maya didn't need to say anything. She simply stood there, letting the truth come to light. Her badge and her presence were enough to keep the crowd's focus sharp and unyielding. Finally, Kevin seemed to realize there was no way out. He lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I didn't know," he muttered weakly, though the words carried no weight. They were empty, meaningless in the face of the evidence mounting against him. "That's not good enough," Maya said sharply. "Ignorance doesn't excuse your actions. You made a choice, several choices, to abuse your authority, and now you'll face the consequences." Her words hung in the air like a final verdict, sealing Kevin's fate. The crowd watched in silence as Maya reached for her phone, dialing a number with practiced efficiency. When she spoke, her tone was professional and commanding. "This is Special Agent Thompson. I need backup at my location immediately. Officer misconduct in progress. Notify Internal Affairs." Kevin's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a public humiliation. It was the beginning of a full-scale investigation into his actions and the culture he had contributed to. Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. Police vehicles pulled up, and several officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of confusion and apprehension as they took in the scene. Maya didn't flinch as they approached, her badge still visible. One of the senior officers, a stern-looking man with silver hair, stepped forward. "Agent Thompson." He greeted her, his tone respectful. "What's going on here?" Maya explained the situation succinctly, laying out Kevin's actions and the pattern of behavior she had been investigating. The senior officer listened carefully, his expression growing graver with each word. When she finished, he turned to Kevin. "Officer Barnes," he said coldly, "you're relieved of duty pending a full investigation." The crowd erupted in murmurs again, their voices filled with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. Kevin looked like he wanted to disappear, his face pale as he was led to one of the waiting vehicles. As the scene began to settle, Maya turned to the crowd. Her voice was steady, carrying a message meant for everyone. "This is why accountability matters," she said. "No one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. And change begins when we speak up, when we refuse to let abuse go unchecked." The crowd responded with nods and murmurs of agreement. Some even clapped, their applause growing louder as Maya stood her ground, a symbol of justice and resilience. By the time the sun set over the small suburban town of Hillside, everything had changed. Kevin Barnes, once a confident officer wielding his badge like a weapon, sat at home, suspended from duty, his reputation shattered. The scene at the bus stop had been broadcast far beyond the quiet streets of the town. Within hours, the video had gone viral. The footage showed every detail: Kevin's aggressive behavior, Maya's calm defiance, and finally the moment she revealed her FBI badge. The caption accompanying the video was simple yet powerful: "When abuse of power meets the truth." The internet erupted. Comments flooded social media. People from all walks of life voiced their outrage, calling for Kevin's immediate dismissal and a thorough investigation into the police department. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the video on a loop, dissecting every second of the encounter. The hashtags #JusticeForAll and #AccountabilityNow trended worldwide. For many, the video was a stark reminder of the power dynamics that often went unchecked in communities like Hillside. But it was also a beacon of hope, a rare moment where justice felt possible. And at the center of it all was Maya Thompson, a woman who had stood her ground and changed the narrative. Maya didn't have much time to process what had happened before reporters began to show up. They crowded outside the small hotel where she was staying, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every word. Maya watched them from her window, her expression calm but thoughtful. She knew this was bigger than her. This was about more than one officer or one department. It was about a system that needed to change. When she finally stepped outside, The reporters swarmed her, shouting questions all at once. "Agent Thompson, how long have you been investigating the Hillside Police Department? Did you expect this kind of reaction from Officer Barnes? What message do you have for people who have faced similar situations?" Maya held up a hand, signaling for silence. The crowd quieted, their cameras trained on her. She took a moment, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't about me," she began, her voice steady. "This is about accountability, about making sure that the people who are entrusted with power use it responsibly. What happened today was just one example of a much larger problem." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "There are good officers out there, people who genuinely want to serve and protect their communities. But their work is overshadowed by those who abuse their authority. That has to stop. And it starts with transparency, with holding people accountable." Her words resonated deeply, sparking applause from a few onlookers who had gathered nearby. The reporters continued to press for more details, but Maya remained composed, answering only what she could while keeping the focus on the larger issues. Behind the scenes, Maya's investigation into the Hillside Police Department gained momentum. The encounter with Kevin Barnes had opened the floodgates. Calls and emails poured in from people who had experienced harassment or misconduct at the hands of local officers. Some shared stories that mirrored Maya's own experience: unprovoked stops, baseless accusations, and aggressive behavior. Others revealed even darker secrets. Maya and her team combed through the evidence, connecting the dots. Patterns began to emerge, pointing to a culture of corruption that ran deep within the department. Officers like Kevin weren't just isolated cases. They were part of a system that enabled and even encouraged misconduct. One by one, names and incidents came to light. There were cases of falsified reports, excessive use of force, and even financial improprieties. Maya uncovered evidence of bribes exchanged to cover up wrongdoings, as well as discriminatory practices that disproportionately targeted certain communities. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing the picture became. But Maya didn't falter. Each revelation strengthened her resolve, reminding her why she had chosen this path in the first place. As the investigation progressed, the fallout was swift and far-reaching. Kevin Barnes became the face of the scandal, his name and actions plastered across headlines. But he wasn't the only one facing consequences. Several officers were placed on administrative leave, while others resigned outright, hoping to escape the inevitable scrutiny. The Hillside Police Chief, a man who had long turned a blind eye to the misconduct within his department, held a press conference to address the growing outrage. He tried to paint the situation as an isolated incident, but the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Public pressure mounted, demanding not only the chief's resignation, but also a complete overhaul of the department. Community leaders organized protests and town hall meetings, urging citizens to speak out and demand change. What had started as a single encounter at a bus stop had grown into a full-blown movement, with Hillside at its center. Weeks later, Maya stood in a federal courtroom, watching as the first of many officers faced charges. Kevin Barnes sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor replaced by a look of defeat. The charges against him were severe: abuse of power, harassment, and falsifying reports. He had no defense, not with the video evidence and Maya's testimony. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict: guilty on all counts. Kevin's sentencing marked a turning point. It sent a clear message that no one, not even those in positions of power, was above the law. But for Maya, it was just one step in a much larger journey. The corruption within the Hillside Police Department couldn't be eradicated overnight. It would take time, effort, and the continued vigilance of the community. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. On the day of Kevin's sentencing, Maya visited the bus stop where it had all begun. The street looked the same, quiet, unassuming, but everything felt different. She stood there for a moment, watching as people passed by, some of them recognizing her and offering a nod or a small smile. A young woman approached her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Agent Thompson, she asked tentatively. Maya turned, smiling warmly. Yes. I just wanted to say thank you, the woman said, her voice filled with emotion. What you did, it gave me courage. My family has been dealing with things like this for years, and we never thought anyone would listen. But now it feels like things might actually change. Maya nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. Change is never easy, she said gently, but it's possible. And it starts with people like you, speaking up, standing together. That's how we make a difference. The woman smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, she said again before walking away. As Maya watched her go, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was long, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The fight for justice was never truly over, but moments like this reminded her why it was worth it. Back at her office, Maya sifted through the latest reports, her focus unwavering. The investigation into Hillside was ongoing, but it had already sparked interest in other towns and cities facing similar issues. Her work was far from done, but she welcomed the challenge. For every person like Kevin Barnes, there were countless others who needed someone to stand up for them, to shine a light on the darkness they faced, and Maya was determined to be that light. As she closed her laptop for the night, she thought back to the day at the bus stop. What had started as a moment of confrontation had turned into something much bigger, a movement for accountability, for change, for justice. And this was just the beginning. As Maya stepped out of the precinct that evening, the world seemed quieter, softer, as if it, too, was taking a moment to breathe. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the pavement. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Maya allowed herself to stop, to feel the weight lifting from her shoulders. This moment was hard-earned. It wasn't just about her victory over Kevin Barnes or the revelations that had come to light. It was about the countless lives that had been impacted by the corruption she'd exposed. It was about the people who had suffered in silence, waiting for someone to hear their voices, someone to stand up for them. As she walked toward her car, Maya thought about the path that had brought her here. It hadn't been an easy one. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, when the fight seemed impossible. But through it all, she had held on to one simple truth: justice mattered. And sometimes it only took one person to make a difference. Maya had always known that her work came with challenges. As a young girl, she had watched her father, a community leader, fight tirelessly for fairness and equality in their neighborhood. He was never the loudest voice in the room, but he had a way of speaking that made people listen. He taught Maya that true strength wasn't in how much noise you made, but in how deeply you believed in what was right. Those lessons stayed with her, guiding her through every choice she made. Becoming an FBI agent wasn't just a career decision. It was a calling. She wanted to be the person who could step into the spaces where others were afraid to go, the person who could face injustice head-on and refuse to back down. But it wasn't always easy. Maya had faced her fair share of resistance, both from the people she was investigating and sometimes even from within her own ranks. There were days when she wondered if the fight was worth it, if the system she was working so hard to fix could ever truly change. And yet, every time she felt the doubt creeping in, something happened to remind her why she had chosen this path. A thank you letter from a family she had helped, a smile from a child who now felt safe walking to school. The small but significant victories that proved change was possible, even if it came one step at a time. The events in Hillside had sparked something bigger than Maya had anticipated. What started as a confrontation at a bus stop had grown into a national conversation about accountability and the power dynamics in law enforcement. People from all over the country were sharing their own stories, their own experiences, demanding change in their communities. Maya received emails and messages from strangers who had seen the video. Some wrote to thank her for standing up, for showing that it was possible to challenge the system and win. Others shared their struggles, their fears, their hopes for a better future. Each message reminded Maya that her work wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about inspiring others to believe in it. One email, in particular, stood out to her. It was from a young woman named Alexis, who wrote, "Agent Thompson, I watched your video, and it gave me courage I didn't know I had. For years, I've been afraid to speak up about what's happening in my town, but seeing you stand so strong made me realize I don't have to be silent anymore. Thank you for showing me that even one voice can make a difference." Maya read the message twice, her chest tightening with emotion. Alexis's words were a reminder that the fight for justice wasn't just about holding people accountable. It was about empowering others to take a stand. As Maya drove home that evening, the streets of Hillside fading in her rearview mirror, she couldn't help but reflect on what the future might hold. The investigation into the police department was ongoing, and there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, Maya felt hopeful. She thought about the people she had met along the way, the witnesses who had come forward, the activists who had organized protests, the citizens who had demanded better from their leaders. They were proof that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when people came together. Maya knew that her work in Hillside was only the beginning. There were other towns, other cities, where the same stories were playing out. She was ready to take on those challenges, to keep pushing for the transparency and accountability that every community deserved. And she wasn't alone. The voices of the people she had inspired would echo long after she was gone, creating ripples that would spread far beyond what she could see. As she pulled into her driveway, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the horizon, Maya sat in her car for a moment, letting the quiet wash over her. She thought about the young woman at the bus stop, the one who had thanked her for giving her family hope. She thought about Alexis's email, about the people who had stood in the crowd that day, capturing the moment that would change everything. Sometimes, Maya realized, it wasn't about how loud you fought. It wasn't about shouting or demanding attention. It was about standing firm, about letting the truth speak for itself. And when the truth finally came to light, it had the power to change everything. Maya stepped out of her car, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She looked up at the sky, the first stars beginning to twinkle against the deepening blue. The world felt big and full of possibility, a reminder that there was always more to fight for, always more to protect. As she walked toward her front door, she allowed herself a small smile. Her work was far from over, but she wouldn't have it any other way. Because at the end of the day, justice wasn't just about winning battles. It was about building a world where everyone had a chance to stand in the light. Maya paused at her doorstep, her hand resting on the doorknob. She thought about the journey ahead, the challenges she would face, the people she would meet. And then she thought about the words her father had once told her. The truth will always find a way, but it needs people to carry it. She carried those words with her, a quiet strength that would guide her through whatever came next. Because Maya Thompson wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting for a world where everyone could believe in it. And as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her, she knew one thing for certain. The truth would always come to light.